Recording. Okay. So once again, welcome to the Mapping Nature-Based Solutions tool for the Charles River Watershed and Beyond webinar. I'm one of your presenters today, Julie Wood, Deputy Director of Charles River Watershed Association. Later, you will be hearing from Jessica Dietrich, the GIS Manager at the Nature Conservancy. This project was a partnership between Charles River Watershed Association and the Nature Conservancy. Our goals for today, the primary one is to provide participants with information on the data that went into the Watershed Nature-Based Solutions mapping tool, because we are hoping to support folks in using the tool. It has a lot of different applicability, so we want folks to, use it in the way that makes sense for you. And to do that, to support you in doing that, we want you to understand what went into the tool and what is kind of the underlying data set that the tool is helping to visualize. We'll present a few examples on different ways the tools might be used. And then, as I mentioned, Jessica's been working to bring this to a statewide audience and statewide geographic extent. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so how can you access the tool? The tool is live. There's the link right there. I'm going to switch my screen a little later to do a live demo for everybody, but it is already live. So it's live and online, accessible. As you'll hear, there's a few areas where updates have been made since the online tool went live. I'll try to highlight those just so folks know that there's a chance some updates or changes could come to the online tool down the line, and I'll try to highlight those areas. But the tool is live and online, no reason to not start using it now. The other way to use the tool is if you partner with Charles River Watershed Association on any projects, as many of you on the call have done, or with some of you, we have some pending grant applications. We've started using the tool basically on all of our projects where we partner with municipalities, and we typically use the tool in a GIS software framework, which allows us to bring in some additional layers and overlays and also do some geographic analysis with the tool results, which can be interesting. So something to keep in mind if we're talking about project ideas down the line. Okay, so as I mentioned, development of the nature-based tool was a joint project between Charles River Watershed Association and the Nature Conservancy. And the project came from some need that was identified, both some overlapping and some different needs that were identified by each of our organizations. And we came together to partner on this project to produce the results I'm going to show you today. So one of the goals from CRWA's perspective was to design a tool that was more applicable to urban and developed watersheds. A lot of the tools that are out there to help identify conservation priorities, for example, or habitat priorities, a lot of those tend to filter out smaller scale opportunities, and unfortunately in some developed communities, the reality is our opportunities are smaller scale. So we didn't want to miss those, by looking at even statewide tools or national tools. Sometimes those can get missed just on the small side. So that was a big priority for us. We also were interested in focusing conservation at some water resource protection features. Again, some things that often don't get factored in when looking at conservation priorities. And then, of course, a tool that incorporates climate change into the way it's prioritizing conservation and restoration opportunities, since that's really key. The tool also demonstrates the importance of resilience planning at the watershed level, and I think some of the examples I'll go through will show you that. You know, we're not just looking at the parcel level or the town level, it's a watershed scale tool. And then ultimately, we're hoping that this tool will help folks locate projects that provide multiple benefits, or what we're calling more bang for the buck here. Because the tool does allow you to visualize multiple benefits, and you can turn things on and off depending on your own priorities. But if you are looking for conservation opportunities that may also help you adapt to climate change, for example, this is the tool for you. So I'm talking to a fairly informed group here, but don't want to make any assumptions. Just to define what we are using the term nature-based solutions to mean. These are tools that rely on nature or natural processes to protect public health and clean water, increase resilience to natural hazards, and also sequester carbon. We, in the tool, we have broken down prioritization opportunities into two major categories, and then there's some subcategories within each of those. So the tool can help you visualize opportunities for conservation as well as restoration. And we'll be walking through the subcategories of those as we get into the methodology a bit more. And just want to highlight an example of nature-based solutions right here in the Charles River watershed, and that is the Natural Valley Storage Area. I know some of you folks are familiar with that because you've heard me present on it before, or someone else from CRWA, but it is really a pretty amazing example. It's over 8,000 acres of protected wetland areas across the entire watershed. They're in 16 different communities across the entire watershed. And this came about, I guess, like almost 40 years ago at this point. The Army Corps, after some devastating hurricanes, the Army Corps was looking at doing flood protection enhancements for the Charles River. And they came up with an idea for a very traditional Army Corps dam and levee type system. And CRWA, one of its early victories as an organization, really pushed back on that plan and actually suggested to the Army Corps and some of the generals that were running it at the time that they look at preserving natural wetland areas as part of the flood control system for the Charles. And ultimately that is what they did. Of course, we do have many dams, including the Army Corps dam that they did build at the mouth of the river between between the river and the harbor. But that's one part of the flood control system. The Natural Valley Storage Area is another part of the flood control system, and a really important part of the flood control system. It really does work. There was an economic analysis of it. You can see yielded over 11 million in flood protection services. So it really does hold that water back in the upper and middle watershed, so it doesn't rush down the river as quickly, causing flooding in the downstream areas. These are beautiful areas too. There's recreational opportunities, natural resource benefits. So many of you have these areas in your communities, and hopefully utilize them and love them. So in developing the tool, we did face some challenges. One was balancing replicability with specificity to the Charles. As I've alluded to, the tool is now being brought statewide, even though it was really piloted at the Charles River Watershed Association level. So we did have that in mind, either that other watershed associations might want to replicate it, or it might want to become we might want to make it into a statewide tool at some point. So we didn't want to make things overly complicated or overly specific to the Charles. I think we we were able to strike a good balance there. One of the things that sort of played into that balance was whether we should employ readily available data, or whether we were doing a lot of pre-processing of the data before it went into the tool. One thing Jessica will talk about is that there were some data changes, or there are going to be some data changes, I should say, in the statewide tool, because some of the data we use in the Charles tool isn't available statewide. Not everyone has access to GIS, either the software or the skill set. We did not want this to be time consuming, either to develop it, to replicate it if we were to develop it again, or for the user. Scoring, which this will make a little bit more sense when I start walking through the methodology, but we didn't want to have an overly complicated scoring system so that basically if you're using the tool and you get the results, you have no idea what you're looking at. We were trying to make it somewhat self-explanatory so it's usable, but also useful and has technical rigor. Incorporating equity and equity concerns into an online mapping tool really was a challenge and is a challenge. That's, I think, one that we continue to struggle with. So if folks have comments on that, be happy to hear them. You'll see we did incorporate it into our restoration piece a bit. At the time we started out, we weren't sure what the final product is. Now we know it is an online tool. But as I mentioned, some folks do have the GIS, and like to be able to do a little bit more analysis. And so, if folks want to use the GIS right now, you can talk to us about that. But it isn't downloadable as a GIS product at this point. And then just some challenges around implementation, spreading the word, part of why we're doing this webinar. We've done some other presentations just to let people know about it. Tracking use in communities. I know of one community that used it, but it's hard we have no real way of tracking it. So it would be great if folks do use this tool and do find it useful, if you could let us know that, and then also give us feedback. We would really appreciate that. Okay, so jumping into the methodology. So as I mentioned, one of the main goals for today is to get folks familiar with what went into the tool so that when you use it, you really feel confident that you understand the data you're getting out of it, and therefore that data can be useful to you. So starting with conservation, as I mentioned, we have the conservation category and the restoration category. Starting with the conservation category, within that we have 4 data categories: coastal flooding, inland flooding, water resource protection, and habitat protection. So those are the different categories of things that we looked at to identify possible conservation areas. In the tool, the data categories can be stacked so you can find areas of overlap. And the final results actually exclude areas of land that are developed, as those show up as restoration priorities. And they also exclude areas that are already protected. And when we walk through the online tool, I'll actually show you how you can visualize those specifically as well, in addition to the conservation mapping results. So this is a list of the data layers that went into each category. These are primarily all readily available data layers from MassGIS, so that there doesn't have to be a lot of specific data inputs or a lot of GIS pre-processing. As I mentioned, we were trying to avoid that. And then the undeveloped lands and unprotected lands are those additional filters. The tool basically tiers land areas in each category. So tier 1 is where you get all your data layers to overlap. So in the example of inland flooding, it would be low-lying, it would be a present-day flood vulnerability, and it would be a wetland area. So it would be a land area that has all 3 of those. So you would get all of that overlap, and that would be your tier 1 land area. Tier 2, it would have 2 of those, and tier 3, 1 of those. Just a note, although tiers 2 and 3 are differentiated right now on the online tool, those most likely will be combined. And so basically you just have tier 1, which is where everything overlaps, and tier 2, which is where either you have 1 or 2 of the data sets showing up. So this is a screenshot from the online tool showing the coastal flood category. And so you have your legend here. Here, this is just the raw data at this point. So in this view that you're looking at now, the protected and developed lands have not been filtered out. And so it is showing you this 3 on the right here actually means where 3 of the layers overlap, where this 2 is where 2 of the layers overlap, and this 1 is where 1 of the layers overlap. So if you do just want to look at sort of the raw data, you can find that on the tool as well. Under this conservation categories heading. As I mentioned, we did do some pre-processing to filter out developed lands, as those are likely better restoration priorities than conservation priorities, and already protected lands. And so when you filter that out, this is just an example of how much it changes in our watershed. So this is another screenshot from the tool where we're showing you coastal flood conservation opportunities. And this is the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 that I just went over. But in this view, the protected lands and the developed lands have been filtered out. So it is clearly a lot less than what you were seeing before that filter came on. And so I just put some slides together to walk through each category. The coastal flooding does incorporate climate-ready Boston data, NOAA hurricane surge, inundation, and historically filled tide lands. As I mentioned, tiers 1 and 2. Tier 1 is going to eventually show you where all 3 criteria overlap, and tier 2 areas that contain just 1 or 2. Okay, inland flooding identifies areas that, if conserved, can protect against the impacts of existing and future inland flooding. So this is where you're helping you prioritize some of those mitigation impacts or adaptation measures. Includes present-day flood vulnerability, low-lying topography based on the LIDAR data, and wetland areas, including a small buffer, since those are areas that are already wet. So there's just a watershed view. Unfortunately, on the tool, as you'll see when I go to the live demo, it can be a little hard to visualize the data at the watershed scale. So these maps were produced using GIS, where it's a little easier to visualize it at the full watershed scale. But this is what it looks like at the tool on the online tool. If you zoom in, an example, right around the Mass Audubon Broadmoor Sanctuary, the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 for inland flooding conservation opportunities. The third category I mentioned was the water resource protection. This is helping, as I mentioned, this is a priority for CRWA to bring some of these things into the conservation priority arena. Oftentimes, you know, conservation focuses more on habitat issues, which is great, of course, but if you can get habitat and some water resource protection from a water supply as well as a ecosystem perspective, then you can combine those and, as I said, get more bang for the buck. Sorry about that. So this includes water supply protection zones, soils with high infiltration capacity, and subbasins that have groundwater stress and need more groundwater infiltration. Obviously, developing areas where you have groundwater stress is going to reduce the amount of infiltration you are getting overall. And then habitat as well, of course, needed to combine that in. And this is where the Nature Conservancy was able to provide a lot of technical expertise and a lot of existing data. So they've done a ton of work, biomap to high integrity wetlands, marsh mitigation areas, above average resilience from TNC resilience and connected lands projects. So they had a lot of go-to resources on identifying high habitat areas as well as habitat connectivity areas. So those areas between high quality habitat that you want to preserve to allow for some migration. So they were able to bring all of that into the tool and consolidate it into the tiers. It's slightly different, the tiering methodology on the habitat. Basically, a tier 1 habitat is present if any of the high integrity habitat, biomap, marsh mitigation, or above average resilience, if any of that has been identified, then it's pretty much a tier 1 high priority habitat area, and tier 2 is for connectivity. So just a data summary slide and screenshot. This basically just pulls everything I just went through, the individual data layers, into one slide. You can see if you do turn everything on the mapping tool, it can get a little overwhelming, but the tool has functionality to help you with that. So if you just click on highest scoring conservation opportunities, it will highlight the tier 1s from each category. So it basically will overlap everything for you and visualize just the tier 1s from each category. Well, I should say actually, it does not have to overlap since there's not a ton of overlap between the inland flooding category and the coastal flooding category. This is actually the overlap between either coastal flooding or inland flooding tier 1s, the water resource protection tier 1s, and the habitat conservation opportunities tier 1s. So this is really calling out areas that could provide flood benefits, could provide water resource benefits, and habitat conservation benefits. So these are kind of really the areas that are all encompassing. Okay, so when you use the tool, what will you find? One thing we have used it to find is traditional conservation opportunities, and that's of course sort of what we had in mind when we developed it. So these might be intact, undeveloped, but still unprotected parcels that have high value, either in one of the categories or ideally all of the categories. So an example of that kind of opportunity is highlighted here from the town of Millis. Basically anything you see here with a colored fill area came up as a priority area in the mapping tool. And so it might, if you are able to pull in the parcel layers, which again is something we do when we work on projects in partnership with communities, then you might find that there are multiple private parcels. Likely you will find there are multiple private parcels, full parcels that are showing up in the tool. Maybe even some of these might be owned by the same person. So it might just help you start a conversation or think about your conservation prioritization a bit different, or some new information into that conservation conversation. Okay. Another thing we found is that the tool can help you identify areas that may be in need of protection but aren't great opportunities for traditional conservation. It's not really a parcel that the town's going to buy, not really a parcel that the local land trust is going to buy, but perhaps it's providing some really important value to the town, so you could consider other protection tools. So another example, again, from Millis, everything in the pink colored area is what was highlighted by the tool as a possible high conservation opportunity. So you can see in the corner of the map here, it's actually pulling out a bunch of very small pieces of really basically just different residential backyards. So it's a whole, whole row of backyards here close to what looks like a small stream. So probably not going to make it to anyone's conservation list to actually think about, purchasing part of a parcel from a bunch of different people. However, by using the tool, you can get an understanding of possibly what benefit having this land be unprotected is providing to the community. So is there some flood benefit? Is there some habitat benefit? Maybe there's some infiltration or water resource protection benefit, in which case perhaps you'd want to think about what kind of other tools might be available to make sure that these areas do stay intact. So maybe it's zoning, maybe it's expanding your wetland ordinance, maybe it's bringing flooding and climate impacts into your local wetlands ordinance. Different tools out there for different folks, but the mapping tool can just help you identify some of those areas that might behoove you to protect, whether it's traditional conservation or not. And then the last one, please tell us if you use the tool. No, I don't want to put any bounds on what you can use it for, how you should use it. So if you're finding other ways of using it, we would love to hear about them. Okay, so just quickly, I'll go through the upland methods, the restoration methods, and then we can get into an online demo. So the restoration priorities have basically two broad scale categories, looking at upland area and then looking at possible in-stream restoration opportunities. I'm going to talk a little bit about the upland restoration, and then on the in-stream, I'm just going to talk about the riparian and floodplain for the sake of time today. But know that there are two other dams and culverts and ecosystem restoration, and I'll show you how to get information on those if that's what you're interested in. So the upland restoration looks broadly at two things. Is there a degradation factor, and is it feasible to do some sort of restoration intervention? And so I've just listed the data sets that went into the degradation factors and went into the feasibility factors. And then the online tool can basically help you find where those overlap. as perhaps if you're just not really sure where to start with your upland restoration, or as you'll hear from Jessica in the statewide tool, it's actually being called Stormwater Restoration. This can maybe help you find some first priority spots. I should say, we have existing parks and open space in the feasibility layer. That won't go for all cases, but it's certainly a place to possibly start looking. And then on this piece, we did also bring in environmental justice, the EPA layer, and then we created a green space desert layer, which basically just looks at areas that are more than a quarter mile from a green space, open space. So areas that are in need of green space and open space. And then this is the one example I wanted to highlight from the in-stream restoration opportunities. This is our riparian and floodplain restoration identifier. And this basically highlights area where impervious cover is within the FEMA floodplains and within riparian zones. So this essentially is showing us where maybe we built a little bit too close to those waterways. And again, now with climate, we may want to be thinking what kind of opportunities we might have in those areas to soften the bank, reduce exposure to flooding, and possibly even enhance some flood control. So that can help you find, the tool can help you find those areas if that's what you're interested in. As I said, please do not let us limit you in how and when and where and why you use the tool, but just some examples. The MVP program, the State Climate Resilience Program, they have put a lot of emphasis on nature-based solutions. So if you want to get a nature-based project funded, maybe this tool can help you find one. You could use it in your MEMA planning processes. MEMA has some grants. Folks probably know about them for pre-hazard mitigation. Your local hazard mitigation plans, which a lot of you are doing in conjunction with your MVP process. Maybe this can help you. You could certainly use it just to find possible hazard areas, so just to find areas of flooding concern. Local planning, we've worked with one community to give them some data as part of their open space planning process, and those are plans you're all doing regularly anyway. Stormwater planning, especially if you're a Charles Emmons Ford community, you've got some stormwater planning to do, so hopefully this can help with that. Open space acquisition, as I mentioned, and community preservation fund, as a possible funding opportunity. Some key takeaways from all this. We just want folks to be not forgetting conservation as a possible tool, even in urban settings, because you can get a lot of bang for your buck with conservation. Jessica's going to talk a bit more about the replication piece or expansion piece. Hopefully you do see it as an opportunity to identify projects with multiple goals. And hopefully you do find it relatively easy to use. We've done all the pre-processing. You don't have to go in and download all the GIS layers or ask your GIS person to do it and come up with these maps on your own. We have done it for you. Okay, so I'm going to quickly switch over to the online demo. Okay, so hopefully everyone on the screen should be seeing the online tool. Do you see that, Lisa?
Not yet. Oh,
okay.
There we go.
Okay. All right. I'm hearing from Lisa. She sees it. So if you don't see it, please message Lisa. Okay, if you put in the link that I shared at the beginning, maybe already of you all did it. You've just been playing with this the whole time I'm talking, which is fine because we want you to use it. So, but if you put in the link, this is what you'll see. Just click on Start Exploring, Go. There is also a tour down here which can walk you through a bunch of the features, probably much better than I can, but I'll do my best to show you some of the highlights. When you get to this drop-down menu, the tool is all under this Charles River Watershed accordion here, so just open that up. There's a bunch of base layers already there available to you. The watershed boundaries, town boundaries, just click on it to turn it on and off. Stream features and water bodies. I think it's nice to have those on as you're looking at everything so you can distinguish those. As I mentioned, we pulled out the developed lands and the protected open space from the conservation opportunities. So if you're wondering why an area doesn't come up, it could be that it's already protected, so you can just load that on yourself. You can change the background if you don't like the background, or some of the colors do conflict actually. Some of the color, you cannot change the colors in the mapping layers. So if they're not showing up that well, given the OpenStreetMap background, just come over to this drop down and change it. You can change it. As you can see, there's a bunch of different options. And then here's the data and the results, conservation and restoration. And so if I go into conservation, conservation opportunities is where you're going to get all the data results. So everything I just walked through. Conservation categories is where you're going to get all that raw data. So if you really are, like to look into the background and the data, that's all here for you. So this was one of the categories I had visualized, the coastal flooding category. I'm sorry it's a little slow. I think it's because my computer is also running the Zoom program, so a little bit of a delay. So bear with me on that. If you forget everything I said today, which is fine and likely and not expected that folks would remember it, there are these amazing info tool pop-up boxes that tells you the underlying data that went into the tool. So you can find that all here. If you are interested in using it either for making maps, or if you have a whole bunch of different stuff that you want to look at all at the same time, you can also make the data display, make the layers display more or less transparent, which is helpful if you're looking at a bunch of different stuff at once. So you can see that comes back on. Okay, so the conservation opportunities, I was just gonna zoom in a little bit so folks can kind of see what kind of things are coming up. So I'm gonna zoom in to the Waltham Weston area. Many of you know our office is here in Weston. So we'll look at what's going on in this area. So if I just click on this highest scoring conservation opportunities and give it a second to load, just as a reminder, this is where we're getting overlap of tier 1 in all the different categories. So you can see that a lot of riparian areas do come up. So a lot of areas right along the river come up. If I put on the protected open space layer as well, a lot of areas that come up are bordering protected open spaces. So maybe it's a piece that didn't get protected but is bordering some nice open space, connecting some open spaces, or bordering some smaller streams as well. So I'm just going to turn that protected open space layer off. And then, of course, what you can also do is click each category on and off. So if there's one primary category that is your concern, you can look at you can look at all the tier 1 areas for that category. You can look at just 2 categories. And so that's the value of the online tool, is you can kind of use it as you wish. And then I'm just gonna go up to the upper watershed for a second example. Look more in the headwater or in the upper watershed region. Unsurprisingly, there are more conservation opportunities as this part of our watershed is slightly less developed. Of course, it is under a lot of development pressure. So there, the tool may take on some different utility. But here you see, there's really a whole sort of north to south corridor right through the town with that's coming up red. And you can click on and off to see. In this case, in particular to the town of Rentham, they have a lot of areas with high quality soils. They have a lot of aquifer area and a lot of area. Let me just turn the red off so you can see here. So a lot of area that's coming up with a high water resource protection score. Again, since they have relatively good soils up here, a lot of groundwater protection areas in Rentham as well. And then I said I was going to show you where you could find a little bit more information about the restoration methods that I didn't go over. So upland restoration opportunities, I talked briefly about that. That's basically our name for possible stormwater management restoration opportunities. This one's long, but can always just click on that and it'll explain, that it's both the degradation factor and the feasibility factor. In-stream ecosystem restoration, this is one I did not go over. But again, you can just come to the info box and read what that one is all about. If that's what you're interested in, I'll try and zoom out and see if we can see some of those coming up. And the in-stream infrastructure, which again is primarily dams and culverts. But you can click on that and just read more about exactly what it's showing you. That's showing in the lighter purple right now, so some areas here. You can also turn dams on in this category so you can see where the actual dams are. And then I mentioned the green space deserts and the environmental justice communities, and everything has that one's missing, I guess, but everything else should have the info box pop up if you forget. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, and we'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Julie. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, so thanks so much to everyone for joining, and to Julie for inviting me to be part of the presentation. I want to go over some of the work we've done as we've been bringing this work to a statewide extent. So I'll highlight some of the modifications we made in the methodology and show you, I thought the best way to sort of show you what it looks like is to show you some maps of what some of the results look like. And I should preface this by saying that I'm a spatial analyst, the GIS manager for our chapter here in Massachusetts. And as Julie alluded to, I've done, most of my work has been around biodiversity and habitat mapping. I've done a lot of work on mapping resilience for nature and for biodiversity. But my colleagues and my colleague that couldn't join us today, Sarah Burns, is a water resource scientist. And we have a lot of, at the Nature Conservancy, we see huge potential in using nature-based approaches to adaptation. So when Julie approached us with this project, we were really excited to join forces and to see, how we could come up with a tool that would be practical and useful for towns. And I'll say one other thing, we always had in the back of our mind that we might want to take this statewide because we knew, we work closely with EEA, and we know that there's interest from EEA in providing tools that help communities go from MVP planning to actually implementation and action grants. So that was, we showed the Charles River work to our partners at EEA, and there was interest in, they saw that tool and they thought it was, they wanted to see it go statewide so it could be a tool for MVP communities and others. So one of the things I want to mention is that we did have the chance to do some peer review and consultation with subject matter experts. So, for the water, what Julie was calling water resource protection, we're calling that drought in this version. We consulted Vicki Zolte, a hydrologist with DCR, Ellie Baker with Horsley Witten, who's done work on mapping drought resilience. We consulted with Sarah White at the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, with Julia Kniesel from the CZM, and Kirk Bosma, who's developed some really sophisticated modeling around sea level rise and storm surge, and then with Mark Voorhees at EPA on the stormwater component. So it was really valuable to get their input and modify some of our methods to reflect what they thought would make sense. We updated the data sources where available. The biggest change was the 2016 land use cover layer, which really enabled us to pinpoint those developed land uses. And we've done work and are doing work to make sure that the messaging and interpretation of what these layers mean is clear to the users. Here's just a snapshot. This is the same slide, basically, of criteria and data layers that Julie showed, but I've highlighted in green what we added to what we've added, so and what we've taken away is crossed out. So for inland flooding, there are no FEMA maps for the western part of the state. So we relied on two models. One is a model of floodplains that was developed by TNC and some academic and floodplain mapping consultants, statewide or nationwide, a 30-meter modeled floodplain. And this modeled active river area, that's like another model that captures really functional riparian buffers, places that are important, that impact the natural processes of the river. Drought, I'll walk through an example of this in a minute, but we made some changes around the soil types that were considered and added in some consideration of the amount of impervious surface within a catchment, thinking that where there's more impervious surface, there's less ability for water to infiltrate and recharge. And then on the habitat protection and connectivity side, for these resilience, some of the resilience metrics and the habitat connectivity metric, I had done some work to customize those for the Charles River watershed because, not a lot popped out for habitat connectivity because that data is scaled regionally. So we went back in this statewide version, we went back to the regional scaling of those data sets. I want to show you this. So this is the example of one layer, the drought hazard layer. So you're seeing a lot of lands highlighted in the eastern portion of the state because those are areas of high demand and more impervious surface. So I'm going to zoom in to really show you the results within one town. This happens to be the town of Grafton that I picked. As the text here says, you know, these dark brown areas, they had to be at least one of those above 10% impervious watersheds, and then include at least one of the other criteria. So a lot of this town of Grafton is part of one of those impervious surface scored watersheds. This is the hazard layer as we're zoomed in. And then this, I want to show you just what we came up with Vicki and Ellie's advice, was really to focus on not just the more porous soils, so the A and B soils, which are shown here in brown, but also to look at type C soils, which are in yellow. So they're less well draining, but we understood that those can be really good areas of recharge during a drought because they are sort of the last remaining places that have water to recharge into the groundwater. And then the purple on this map, that's all of the wetlands and surface water with a 100-foot buffer. So the conservation for drought layer prioritizes areas that are a little further, that are beyond this 100-foot buffer, thinking that those areas will be critical places for recharge during drought. This just walks you through areas that were excised based on, if they were permanently protected or they were what we considered converted or developed. You can see the land use cover types there in the legend. So ag lands, impervious surface, developed open spaces. And then this is the result when you're for drought resilience. So areas in the darker green are those type C soils. And then this is a little bit, I've mocked up what Julie was showing you with the online tool. So I've overlaid here the habitat layers in this hatching. So, by combining these layers, I pointed out in these red arrows, places where you would get, a drought benefit as well as a habitat co-benefit by conserving lands in those areas. And then just quickly, this is the flood map or the flood hazard layer for this town. So the FEMA map is shown in dark purple, but the light purple is the rest of that footprint. So we're identifying places beyond what's strictly regulated by FEMA as places that could contribute to flood attenuation. And in green here are the pieces that are left that are not developed and they're not yet protected. So these are conservation opportunities for flood attenuation. So you could do the same thing, look at where these overlap with drought, with habitat to see where you get co-benefits. And then the other component that I wanted to highlight was we did go back and revise the methods for that upland restoration piece. So we're calling it stormwater restoration opportunities. And this is where we worked with Mark Voorhees at EPA, who has developed the OPTI tool, which is a tool that helps to identify and cite best management practices for stormwater. So we took some of the criteria that go into that tool. So some of the initial criteria that look at soil type, slope, distance to development. And so we pulled out those those areas statewide, thinking that this result can help point communities towards areas that can address stormwater issues. And since there's some of the same criteria that EPA uses in its grant selection, these could also point towards areas that might qualify for funding. I'm going to show you an example here in Worcester. So you see basically the shades of, these are all areas that meet above 15 or below 15% flood slope criteria, and then they're just categorized as to their soil type. And I'm going to zoom into one spot here that's showing, now I've overlaid our flood hazard layer. You can see this parking lot is getting pulled out as a potential place where you could work on stormwater remediation, and that might also address the flood hazard. So those are just a few of the data products. There's 13 total data layers grouped as to hazards, conservation opportunities, and restoration opportunities. We're in the final stages of finalizing those layers and the accompanying report and metadata. And these will be available as downloadable GIS files. And also will be going onto an online viewer. We're just sorting out where exactly they'll live online, but we want to make them available to communities online. So that wraps up my portion. So I think we're going to pause here and field any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Jessica. Thank you, that was great.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, type them into your chat box. Hopefully everybody had a minute to find the chat box. You can either send them in a group chat to everyone or send them just to Lisa. I guess while folks are thinking of their questions, Jessica, do you know the time frame on the statewide? You said you guys are finishing up, mostly just the documentation and reporting piece on that. Do you have a sense when that might be available?
Say by the end of January, that should be tied up with a bow, and we are going to be presenting this work at some of the spring conferences. So by then, we'd like to have it online.
Great. We have one question here. The question is, can the layers be downloaded for ArcGIS anywhere? Cool. Yeah. So I'm assuming that is related to the Charles River specific tool. We do have a final GIS package. It is not online for download. So you should, if you're interested in getting the GIS layers, you should email me there at jwood@crwa.org, and we can facilitate getting that to you. What's online for the Charles tool, obviously, is the online mapper. And then, as Jessica was saying, the statewide tool will be available as GIS download in January. Sometimes it's nice to have, we do tend to, when we work with the data, we do tend to do it in the GIS platform. As you saw in the example I presented, we overlaid parcel layers, which of course is a useful piece of information to add into the conversation when you're looking at stuff at the community level. Any other questions from folks? Well, as I said, we really do hope folks will use it and let us know how you're using it. So I just want to put in another plug for that. And if we don't have any other questions, we can wrap up a little early. Obviously, feel free to email me if you think of a question later. Happy to hear from folks. So thanks everyone for taking the time to, oh, we did have a question. Is there a feedback form? Yes, I was going to send a, yes, if you have specific feedback, please feel free to email me directly. Actually, I guess I should clarify. I was going to do a feedback form for the webinar. There is no feedback form on the tool, I don't believe. Right, Jessica? There's no like specific. Okay. So yes, if you have feedback on the tool, then yes, please just email me directly. Okay, well, as I said, thank you all for taking the time. Thanks for interest in this. Please do use it and let us know what you think. Let us know how you're using it. Again, if you want to work with us to work on something with you, that's always something we're open to as well. All right. Well, happy holidays, happy new year to everyone. As I said, the recording will be on CRWA's new website later today or first thing tomorrow. And we will look forward to hearing your feedback. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.